Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Ashley Nunes. He is the Director of Federal Policy, Climate, and Energy at the Breakthrough Institute. Ashley, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I didn't warn you. I warned some guests. I didn't warn you. Guests on this podcast introduce themselves. I've given your title at the Breakthrough Institute, but imagine you've arrived somewhere. You have a minute or so to introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Ashley Nunes. I am the Director for Federal Policy, Climate, and Energy at the Breakthrough Institute. I'm also a researcher at Harvard Law School and economics lecturer in the Department of Economics at Harvard College.
And you're so are you a lawyer? I'm just curious. You said you're teaching at the law school. Are you a lawyer? Are you what? Tell me
I'm a researcher at the law school. I teach in the economics department, where I have at least for the past couple of years, mostly on climate economics. But my formal appointment at Harvard is through the law school.
Gotcha. Okay, so you live in Boston, but Breakthrough's in Berkeley or Oakland now.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we have two offices now. Our central office is in Berkeley, California, and the second office, we just opened up a DC office. So I'm really based out of the DC office.
Gotcha. Okay. So you testified, you've written a lot about electric vehicles, and that's what I want to talk about today. And you testified before Congress on April 26th to a House committee. You made 4 points about emissions, about cost, about minerals, and then about what possible better ways forward. I'm giving a brief summary of what you said to Congress. Could you walk us through those different parts of what you discussed with, or what your testimony to Congress, what your key points were there?
Sure. Right. Well, I think, the first point was that, people often think of electric cars as being a means of lowering emissions. And much of our work has demonstrated that just because this technology, indeed any technology, can deliver a benefit, doesn't necessarily mean that it will. So that's the first point. The second point, which I think is something that people often overlook in the public policy space, is the notion of price, and specifically what the upfront price is to consumers for purchasing an electric car. So historically, the idea has been that as technology gets better and as production volume increases, prices drop. But that's not what we are seeing in the market, at least. In fact, what we demonstrate is that in inflation-adjusted dollars, the price of electric cars is actually going up, not down. The third point we make, which I think is something that many Republicans have been quite concerned about, is the shortage of critical minerals that are associated with building electric vehicle batteries. And even amongst Democrats, I think there is a concern, certainly, that this is something that warrants attention. So if we think about, critical minerals like lithium and cobalt and nickel and manganese, there's only so much of that we can find domestically. And what that does is it increases our reliance on foreign markets, of course, the most notable being China, which is responsible for processing the majority of these minerals. And the fourth point, to me at least, is this notion of launching what I call a Sputnik race of sorts for a cheap electric car, which is that there's so much focus on bringing electric cars to the market without really understanding what the needs of American consumers actually are. I think what we need to do is we need to incentivize firms to come up with really novel ways of constructing the types of electric cars Americans are willing to buy.
Yeah. Well, let's walk through those. And maybe we'll start with the emissions part of this, because this is the part that I know some researchers at Cal Berkeley have done this. I think at the Haas Energy Center at Berkeley have done and made this point, and you make it in your testimony. You point out that for many households that own EVs, I'm just finding, I printed out your testimony here, that in fact EVs are often in many households the second or even the third vehicle. So the assumption that they're going to be driven a lot of miles doesn't necessarily result, or because they aren't driven as much as expected, the emissions reductions aren't as large as expected or projected. Is that a fair summary of how you've calculated this?
Well, I think there are two separate issues here. You mentioned Haas, of course. UC Berkeley has Lucas Davis, who does some amazing work. I
Right.
think on examining the economics of electric vehicles, as does Fiona Berlick at the University of Chicago, and David Rapson at the University of California, Irvine, or excuse me, Davis. Um, there are two separate issues that I think warrant scrutiny when we think about the emissions profile of electric cars. The first is what would you do in the absence of purchasing that car? Right? So most people assume that in the absence of purchasing an electric car, you would go out and purchase a internal combustion engine or a gasoline powered car. And if that's the comparison, then yeah, maybe there's some emissions benefit to driving the EV, but we'll get to that in just a second. However, if without the electric car, you would have either used public transit, right, to make those trips, or you would have never made those trips at all, because this is what we refer to as induced demand, then you're not better off driving the electric car, regardless of how clean that car is.
Mm,
Because public transit, right? Those trips are going to go regardless. The bus is still going to run. You might as well, lower your emissions footprint even lower by just riding the bus
right.
or not making those trips at all. So, when we look at data from mature markets like Norway, which we hear a lot about, we generally see that electric cars serve as secondary or tertiary vehicles. This is very consistent with data that, or analysis, excuse me, that, researchers like Lucas Davis, for example, at Berkeley have found. Now, assuming it's the case you do in fact drive an electric car, because the emissions footprint of building the vehicle itself is usually about, it tends to be, well, it's about 8 tons versus about 13.8 tons, a factor of two effectively. And that mostly comes from the battery, the manufacturing of the
So
battery
I'm sorry
itself.
to I'm sorry to interrupt. The
Sure.
8 tons, you lost me on the 8 tons, 13 tons. What is so you're comparing ice vehicles versus EVs? What are those
That's
numbers
correct.
referring
Yeah.
to?
So usually it'll be about 8 tons of CO2, if I recall correctly. Please forgive me. It's usually about 8 tons of CO2 is typically what it would take in terms of the emissions footprint to construct an internal combustion engine.
Right. Okay. Now I'm with you.
And then the
And
emissions footprint for constructing, for manufacturing an electric vehicle is it's close to about 14 tons, assuming, of course, you build a similarly sized vehicle that also has comparable range. Right? This is very important to understand. You need to compare two vehicles that have similar range. And the
gotcha.
reason why is because if because producing the battery for an EV is so mineral intensive, you can dramatically lower the emissions footprint of the EV if you just use a smaller battery.
Right.
Right? And this is what we see, interestingly enough, in many analyses today. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, manufacturing an EV has a higher, emissions footprint, but it's not that much higher. And of course, then you start digging through the details and you realize they've used very small batteries, offering consumers the type of range that they would never put up with, at least the average American household.
Sure. And that's the trend, isn't it, in EVs to try and pack in more range to give the consumer less range anxiety, right? That's one of at least that's what I see advertised is, oh, look at our range of our vehicles, 200 miles, 300 miles, right? There I don't see very many vehicles advertised saying, oh, our range is only 30 miles or something like that. Range anxiety is a real concern for drivers, no?
It certainly is. I mean, I think the Department of Energy released some data a few months ago in which they were looking at what the average range was of an internal combustion engine, and they were
Mm-hmm.
comparing that to an EV.
Right.
And if you were to go out and you were to buy an internal combustion engine powered vehicle today, you would typically get a range of upwards of about 405 miles. You go out and you try to buy an EV today, and on average, you will get a range of about 230 miles,
Right.
right? It's a pretty significant difference between the two.
Sure.
And I mean, for better or worse, we as Americans have gotten used to the idea of having a vehicle that can, in fact, travel upwards of 400 miles.
Right.
So,
Well,
you know,
and that means that also means that if you're having to stop to recharge or refuel, as the case may be, the shorter the range, the more time you have to spend charging, right? I saw this when I drove to Oklahoma and back over the weekend, right? And I stopped and refueled, but the travel time is we as I put it, we think about our travel not in miles and rather we think about it in time. We have time budgets, not necessarily, we don't really care how far something is, right? We care about how long it takes to get there. So that range is directly tied to the recharging, and then also that need to sit and recharge. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think what you are alluding to correctly is what we call the opportunity cost of charging your battery.
Aha.
And
Okay.
so today, if you go out and you try to top off your tank, it'll take you, at most maybe 5 or 10 minutes, right? You pull off to the side, you stop at a gas station, you can, gas up your tank in less than 5 or 10 minutes, and you're on the road again, and you
Right.
can cover 400 miles. You don't have that opportunity for an electric car, of course, because the time it takes to charge the vehicle is much, much longer. And when it takes much, much longer, of course, what that does is it increases the amount of time any trip is going to take, right? Regardless of how convenient charging stations are.
Right.
And I feel
Gotcha.
as though this is something that people often don't necessarily think about, right? Is that it may well be the case that you do in fact have access to easy charging, which most Americans don't. Let's be very clear about this. Right? It may well be the case that you do have access to easy charging, but the time it takes to charge that vehicle to bring it up to an 80% charge or a 90% charge is the type of time that people simply don't actually want to spend.
Sure. Well, and I saw that there's a big chain here in Texas and Bucky's, right? I like you say, I got 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to fuel up. I'm going to pee. I'm going to buy some beef jerky or whatever it is, and then be back on the road. But let's get back to the emissions, because you made a key point in your testimony before the House committee on April 26th. You said that we estimate, you and your colleagues, that in many American households, EVs must remain in service for upwards of at least 10 years to deliver an emissions benefit compared to ICE vehicles. There is little evidence that suggests this outcome is being realized today. I mean, what you're saying is that if EVs are going to, I'm going to read it back to you, if EVs are going to make a significant reduction in emissions, you have to drive them a lot. And that's one of the problems. They're not being driven as much because they're secondary or tertiary vehicles. Is that a fair summary?
I think that we want to distinguish between how many miles an EV travels versus how many years you have to hold on to the vehicle for,
Okay, fair enough.
right?
Okay,
So the more miles you travel, of course, the fewer years you have to hold on to that vehicle for it to deliver what we would call its green lead, right,
okay,
over the
okay.
internal combustion engine. The problem is that any vehicle that is purchased as a secondary or tertiary vehicle will by default cover fewer miles than the primary car,
Gotcha.
right? Because typically when if you have a wife and you have kids, etc., and you decide to get a second car, that second car is usually covering a small fraction of the overall number of miles in a household,
Right.
right? It might just be so the kids can go to soccer practice while your partner is going to get groceries, etc., etc., etc.
Sure.
And what that means usually is that if we look at data, for example, from the Department of Transportation, it's a pretty consistent trend. I think the primary car will usually cover about 10,000 or 11,000 miles. The secondary car will cover about 6,000 miles. The tertiary car will cover about 3,000 miles. So it just keeps going down
Mm,
for every single additional car you have. And where the EV is concerned, the fewer miles you travel in that vehicle, the longer in years you have to hold on to that car for.
right.
So I think
Gotcha.
the study you are alluding to is a study we had done last year with my colleague Philip Rossetti at the R Street Institute and Lucas Woodley at Harvard, in which we found that yes, there are certainly instances where an EV has to stay on the road for upwards of 10 years before we begin to see an emissions benefit for driving the vehicle. And what I often tell people is, I don't know too many people driving a 10-year-old electric car. Do you?
Right. Well, and then you start to run into the degradation of the battery as well, which is another kind of unknown at this point. I don't know what those lives of those batteries are, and the recycling thing is a whole other set of issues. But let's talk about cost, because this is one of the things that I've written a lot about, and it's one of the things that I've say, EVs are not, these are not Volkswagens. These are not cars for the masses. The average, as I recall, the average household income for an EV buyer is between 120 $140,000. That's 2x the national average. And you point this out in your congressional testimony. You said EVs, your first line on talking about cost barriers, you said EVs are expensive. Average price of a new EV was at least $20,000 more than a similarly sized ICE vehicle. Why is it? Well, I want to ask about that cost issue, but I look at a lot of the climate issues as in class terms, and this is very much a class issue. I think about who can buy, who can afford EVs, and the charging stations, which the cost of which are largely being socialized. Do you think about it in class terms, or why isn't this issue of affordability getting more play when the Biden administration is making such a big push for electric vehicles?
Well, I don't want to speak for the administration.
Of course.
I think, in fact, I think there was a funny excerpt during the hearing where I was asked why the Biden administration, doesn't look at alternative technologies like hybrids, for example. And I think I said something to the effect of, well, I'm not authorized to speak for the administration. Um, you know, I think there are two separate issues here. It is certainly true that if you look at data from, for example, the Congressional Research Service, what they will generally find is that, most people who are buying EVs today are in fact middle to upper income Americans. There are two reasons for why that's the case. The first, of course, certainly is because of the price of these cars. The second is because historically, the tax benefits that the government would afford to an individual for purchasing an electric car were structured as credits, not refunds. And when you structure a government program or a government benefit as a credit and not a refund, it will by consequence benefit upper income Americans, right? Because they are the only households that have sufficient tax liability to offset, or rather, they have sufficient tax liability, excuse me, to claim those types of credits. When you make those credits available as refunds, which is something that IRA effectively does by, sort of converting a credit into a refund at the point of sale at the dealership, you should see a change in the types of households that actually go out now and buy electric cars. My suspicion is that that will be very difficult still, because as we have pointed out, the price of these cars is still relatively high, right? I think in the testimony, as you point out, we were saying it was about at least a $20,000 difference. In fact, our actual estimate is that the average price of an electric car in 2022 was upwards of $70,000. You know, so
I'm
it's
sorry. I want you to follow up on that because I've seen various numbers. Right, I've seen as low as 55,000. Yours is
Mhm.
some 66. You're saying it was upwards of 70,000. How did you get to that number?
Well, what we do is we take every electric car that's sold on the market, right? And then what we do is we just say, okay, what's the median price? What is the average price? I know I sympathize with your position, which is that, and we found similar numbers, and the reason why they arrive at those numbers very often is they will either use a sales weighted average, so they look to see how many cars are selling, right? So if you have more cheaper electric cars that are selling, it pulls the sales weighted average down.
Right.
Alternatively, what they will do in some instances is they will either exclude certain vehicles, or when they compute the average for those cars, the average price, they will only look at a given month.
Uh huh.
And that's what ends up happening is you end up with numbers that are just all over the place.
Right.
So what we felt as though, was that, suggesting that the average price of an electric car was at least $20,000 higher insulated us from claims that, we were exaggerating what the true price differential actually was, at least the upfront price differential.
Well, and if it's 70 grand, I mean, this is Benz and Beamer territory, right? This is not the Chevy Impala or something like that. So again, it goes to these who's going to be able to afford that? It's the upper income Americans, not the average motorist. Is that fair?
Well, that's fair. I mean, look, the top selling electric car from 2022 was the Model Y. The Model Y starts at, I think it's upwards of $65,000. It's hard to imagine that, someone walks into a showroom and purchases a Model Y at $65,000 without any add-ons. right?
Right.
I think it's less likely than not. To the extent that that is true, immediately, even without tax, etc., you have a price upwards of $70,000. And $70,000 is more, right, or as close to the median family income in the United States.
Right.
People can't afford these cars. And I think this is a real problem that the that both this administration and previous administrations have failed to, consider because again, if you look at what's happening with pricing in the auto market, prices are going up, right? In fact, the price of everything is going up in any market.
Right.
So the question isn't are prices going up, it's are prices going up at a rate that outpaces inflation, which is worrying in and of itself. But it's also whether these price increases are outpacing price increases, excuse me, that we see for internal combustion engines.
Right.
And that is exactly what is happening. So you can offer someone all the tax credits or tax rebates you want. I think I argued this in a Chicago Tribune piece a few months ago. When you offer $7,500 off to someone for purchasing a $75,000 car or an $80,000 car, and that household makes $60,000, they don't care what the size of the credit is. They're not going to buy the car regardless.
So I just want to repeat what you said, if I don't mind. I want to make sure I got it
Please.
right. So what you're saying is what you have seen, what you are, and your numbers are showing. The inflation rate for EVs is greater than the inflation rate for ICEVs or
The,
internal
infl-
combustion engine vehicles.
the inflation adjusted price for EVs is rising faster than the inflation adjusted price that we see for internal combustion engines.
Right. So isn't it also? I mean, so you're talking about cost here. So we're talking about the idea of adoption, right, of EVs. One of the other trends, macro trends in the auto sector as well, is that Americans are keeping their vehicles longer. I mean, I'm evidence of that. I just put a new vehicle, a new crate engine in my 2005 4Runner, right? I spent $13,000 on a new engine rather than 40 or $50,000 on a used vehicle that would be comparable, or 60,000 for a new one, right? But
Mhm.
so the average age of vehicles on American roads is increasing as well, isn't it? We're at 12 or 13 years is average for the age of the average car on the American roadways. Isn't that the case?
That is a fair assessment. I think, Department of Transportation data consistently shows a steady uptick in how old. I think what you're alluding to is what the age is of the national vehicle stock,
Right.
right? The average age of a vehicle on our roads today. Yes, it's going up. There's a question as to why it's going up. I think many economists would argue that part of the reason why, certainly, is that the price of cars is going up.
Right.
And as the price of cars goes up, you're more inclined to drive the vehicle you currently own.
Right.
Um,
So the inflation, the cost inflation across the economy, right, and people's disposable income, they're less inclined to buy a new car because new cars are expensive. So they're going to keep the old one longer.
That's certainly one reason, I think, for why we see that. It doesn't necessarily help that interest rates are relatively high. And, as purchasing a vehicle is the second most cash intense, I think, endeavor that most households will engage in. And because of that, the I think the case for buying a new vehicle versus holding on to the vehicle you currently own is quite strong.
Right. Why did Chevrolet just announce, GM just announced they're killing the Chevy Bolt? This was one of the, or Chevy, that's right, the Chevy Bolt. This was one of the inexpensive EVs. Can you comment on that? You know why they're killing that vehicle? That was one of the ones that was the kind of their flagship in terms of EVs and one of the lower cost EVs on the road. Can you
Well,
talk about
Chevy,
that?
well, they like money, as do I. And when I see an asset that doesn't make money, I question what the purpose of the asset actually is. I mean, look, when they killed the bull, this actually occurred the night before my colleagues and I testified before the House of Representatives. And when we came in that morning, we had a very productive conversation with members across the aisle, who had the exact same question: what's going on? And what's going on is that EVs are a venture that are yet to demonstrate a viable path to profitability, right? It's very cash intensive. The margins are very, very slim. unless you are selling very high-end vehicles. And currently, all indicators show that the place where you can make money is by marketing vehicles to high-income Americans, not to middle and low-income Americans. And when those are the economics that you are confronted with, why would you have a vehicle on the market that sells for, 26 or $27,000?
Those are they want to sell Escalades, not what Chevy Vegas. I'm pulling something out
Again,
the
a
way
low
the Wayback Time Machine.
Well, look, a low margin enterprise can work and can deliver very, very large returns in aggregate if it scales,
Right.
right? So you can make 1 cent on every single car that you sell, but if you can sell billions of cars, you
Sure.
know, you're making a ton of money.
Right.
The problem is they're not selling billions of cars. They're not selling millions of those cars, not even, hundreds of thousands of those cars.
Right.
Those are cars that they're selling in the thousands. The economic model simply doesn't make sense for that vehicle profile, at least currently.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point that you make, and I did a short video on this, but it was Ford Motor Company, and what did they lose? Was it more than $1 billion on their EV business? They were losing, my calculation, $34,000 on every EV they made last year. You don't make that up. You don't make up for that in volume, right? So is Tesla actually making, because you said the EVs are a venture yet to demonstrate a viable path to profitability? Is Tesla the only company that is actually making money?
One of the auto analysts I certainly respect is Colin Langan, and he's a Tesla analyst at Wells Fargo. And if you look at his investor notes, he and his colleagues are very upfront about even companies like Tesla and how challenging the path to profitability actually looks for these companies. I think there's a question as to what that path looks like and where the margins actually are. Right. So Tesla, for example, doesn't really spend a lot of money in the way of advertising, as you know, because its head is
Right.
a very eccentric individual. So there are some cost savings there. There are some cost savings to be realized, for example, through economies of scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can there be a path to profitability? Sure, there can. The question is, who are you trying to sell that product to? Because if you are trying to sell that product to high income individuals, the path to profitability is much, much easier.
Right.
The minute you try to get, penetration in the middle and low income segment of the distribution, it becomes much, much more challenging.
Because the margin per unit is lower.
I think it's more accurate to say because the willingness and the ability to pay for this particular demographic, for the average American, etc., is lower. And by virtue of the willingness to pay being lower, your margin shrinks considerably if that's the market you want to penetrate.
I see. Okay, so then, let me read that back to you. If you're going to try and hit that market, they may have to spend more, or they may not have the money to spend more. They're not going to be able to buy a premium vehicle that would be more profitable to the maker, the automaker. Is that what I'm hearing you say, or is it
Yeah, I
other
think that's
factors
fair.
as
I mean,
well?
let's imagine, for example, that you have a $60,000 car, right? Let's assume just for a second that the manufacturing costs all in is $60,000, and you want to make $10,000 in profit, right? So that puts the sticker price up to $70,000. A high income household presumably has no problem with paying that, right? So
Right.
you get the totality of the aggregate margin that you're looking for, $10,000. Now, if you have a car that you are trying to sell to middle income Americans, and let's assume that the manufacturing cost is $30,000, you still want your $10,000, right? You tack that on, you're now at $40,000. But guess what? Many American households don't want to pay $40,000. You know that your manufacturing costs, the cost you have to recover to run a viable enterprise is at least 30,000. So the only way you can lower your price is by dipping into your own margin, right? You have
Right.
to lower how much you are willing to accept. And
Gotcha.
this gets to very classic supply and demand, right? It's, what is the equilibrium price, as we say in economics? But it's really the maximum price that consumers are willing to pay for that product balanced against the minimum price, in this case, the automaker is willing to accept.
Gotcha. Let me stop for a second. I want to talk about minerals and metals and magnets here in just a second. But um, one of the questions I wrote down is why is there such an aura around EVs, right? There's a halo around them. And I've written about electric vehicles. This is not a new technology. Edison, drove an electric vehicle is more than 100 years ago. We've heard the promises, and I can cite you, quotes from the Los Angeles Times from 120 years ago talking about the potential value of the EV. Why today is there such an aura around them? Why are the policymakers so enamored with EVs?
Well, again, I cannot speak to or speak for what policymakers actually think and why that's the case. My sense is that this is a technology that offers a means of emissions reductions at a time that we need those reductions more than ever, right? However, just because we need those reductions doesn't necessarily make this technology the best way of going about that. I think that when you've invested a significant amount of public funds in a solution or a potential solution, it's very, very difficult to walk it back. Right. So if we look at electric vehicle subsidies in the United States, just as an example, I mean, these subsidies date back. I mean, this, predates the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration. I think the first real subsidies that we see for electric cars go back to the second Bush administration, 2006, 2007. And back then, they were actually subsidizing hybrid electric vehicles as well. So, these are long-standing subsidies. It's a policy that the government bought into for over many, many years. And we have seen similar policies in countries like Norway, which we often hear quite a lot about, right? And
Right.
in Norway, I think, the parliament in Norway first adopted electric vehicle subsidies as a policy in 1990. The first policies actually went into effect in 1992. So, there is a bit of momentum, I think, currently to do something about climate change. And if you can just tell people, hey, look, we're all in for this technology that can deliver emissions reductions. The hope, I guess, in some ways, is that no one will actually take the time to look under the hood to figure out if the policy is actually working.
And that's what you're doing.
Well, I think it's something that many people are doing. There are some very gifted and talented researchers who are trying to understand this, not because we don't believe in electric cars. Let me be very clear. I don't have a position on electric cars one way or the other. I don't drive a car. I use public transit. Okay. But I do
Do you
think
have a
that
driver? Do you have a driver's license?
I do. I used to drive, and I gave up driving about 12 years ago. So
Really?
uh,
So you've
yes.
never, so you don't, you haven't owned a vehicle for a dozen years.
That's correct. I had a Mercedes actually. I sold it in 2011, I believe, or 2012.
And so you Uber or you take the bus or you
I take
ride.
the bus and I walk. I Uber if it's or take a taxi if it's absolutely necessary.
But if you
But
want
as
to go to
a,
the, say you want to go to the beach, if you live in the DC area and you want to go to the Barrier Islands in North Carolina, how do you get there?
uh, I don't know, I haven't been to the beach.
Okay,
When
well,
was the
there
last
you
time I
go.
went to the beach? I have to think about that. Yeah, no, I mean, listen, the single largest predictor of economic mobility for households today is auto ownership. Right? This is a well-documented phenomenon that if you give people access to a car, they are able to increase their wages, which increases their standard of living. Whether we like it or not, people need to own cars, at least when it comes to moving up the economic ladder.
Right.
The question is, how do we do that in a way that does not also penalize us because of climate-related, externalities? And then this is where good people can disagree. The one thing I can honestly tell you is, having worked in this space for a while, everybody thinks they have the right answer,
Right.
right? Everybody thinks their model is the best model, that what they're saying is absolutely true. All I can tell you is our assessment of the electric vehicle market is based on what we currently see. it's based on. And then these are numbers that don't really lie. You can walk into a Tesla showroom today. You can figure out what is the cost of a Model Y. You can look at what the cost was of a Model Y last year, the year before that, the year before that. You can adjust it for inflation and say, okay, what's happening with prices?
Right.
What I cannot say is what prices will look like next year or the year after that.
Sure.
Uh,
Well, that brings us to the other part that you talked about in your congressional testimony. And by the way, my guest again is Ashley Nunes. He's the director of federal policy, climate, and energy at the Breakthrough Institute. You can find his work at thebreakthrough.org on the web, thebreakthrough.org. Um, Critical minerals, metals, and magnets. This is the other. These are the key inputs, and as everyone well knows, I think the material inputs for EVs are far higher than those for internal combustion engines. And I live in Austin, Texas, and I flew over the new Tesla factory here the other day when I was flying out of town. And when I fly over that, and I've driven past it as well, I think that is a massive structure. One, and it is just an incredibly big building. But I look at it as a very long bet on a few commodities, including lithium, cobalt, and battery. The things that go into batteries. Those other commodities. Is that ultimately what the EV business is about? The bet on that these commodities are going to remain relatively low cost for a long time, and in particular, lithium and the other components that go into lithium ion batteries?
I think it's difficult to say whether many of these companies are betting on the current pricing structure, because if they were, they would be losing that bet, right? If you look at the commodities market, if we look at mineral prices, for example, there is a significant amount of volatility in the commodities market.
Right.
But what we can say is that over the past 10 or 15 years, and my colleague Lorena Hugh at MIT has done some great work on this. If you look at mineral prices in general, the prices are ticking upwards, even after you adjust for inflation.
Right.
So again, this is one of the reasons that we suspect why electric vehicle prices are going up, right? Is because the inputs are just quite expensive and they're not getting any cheaper. There certainly is some work that's currently going on trying to come up with new types of technologies, sodium ion batteries, for example, or lithium ion phosphate batteries. But the viability of many of these technologies is unclear at best currently. Even if you could get these technologies to be a viable enterprise, or at least to work, that doesn't necessarily mean they are the most cost-effective solution for emissions reductions. And I think this is where I disagree with some of my colleagues who work in this space, who are, sort of very big EV proponents. They'll say, well, you're talking about these cases where the EV isn't necessarily the best means of lowering emissions, but as long as it lowers emissions, that's all that matters. Um, it might be that, all that matters if you didn't have a small problem. And that problem is the government only has so much money.
Right.
So you need to invest that money on a program that maximizes emissions reductions per dollar spent. And if we look at the way the program currently works, it's simply not doing that.
Well, that's a hard. It's not a hard assessment. It's a very clear assessment. If I read it back to you this way, let me see if you agree. What you're saying is that the government is spending a lot of money on EVs, and it's not getting much bang for its buck in terms of CO2 emission reduction. Is that a fair read back?
It is, I mean, Chris Knittel is an economist at the Sloan School at MIT. Some of his work has shown that I think it's upwards of 60% of people would have bought the EV regardless of whether or not you offer them a subsidy. So why are we offering them a subsidy? Is that really the best way we can spend our public funds when it comes to lowering emissions? And I think this is, again, this is a difficult problem, and let's be, upfront and generous to the people who disagree with us. They are not happy about this any more than we are, right? But again, when a policy does not work, or at least does not work in the way in which it was intended, it is important for people to be upfront about it and change course appropriately. And unfortunately, in today's political dialogue at least, I think that's often seen as a sign of weakness, unfortunately.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me of something Sam Harris says about belief, and he was talking about religious belief. But he said there's a certain amount of sunk costs, right? That when people invest in this one ideology for so long, they're very reluctant to give it up. Is that what we're seeing here? There's political sunk costs in EVs, and to course correct and say, well, we didn't mean it or we made a mistake would be then to admit they were wrong. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing even the Secretary Granholm saying the U.S. DoD should electrify their vehicles. Is that evidence of this kind of sunk cost mentality?
I think there is certainly a fair amount of sunk cost mentality. I want to be very clear. There actually are a number of instances where it does, in fact, make sense to electrify vehicles. So, for electrifying school buses, for example, I'm a proponent of that. I think it's a great idea. Electrifying the taxi fleet, I think that's a great idea. Taxis typically put on far more miles
Sure.
than conventional autos that you and I drive. And
And they're returning back to a car barn or the same location.
absolutely.
So that infrastructure is going to be in place, and they're going to go back to that same spot for refueling, recharging every
Absolutely.
day.
And then the third area where it makes sense to electrify, to me at least, is the trucking industry. That again covers very, very long miles, and very often, remember, these are vehicles that need to be parked, right, to conform to the rest requirements for truck drivers. So there are, in fact, instances where it does make sense to electrify a given transportation medium, but that hardly means we should electrify every single thing on the road today, right, as a pathway towards emissions reductions. Particularly, and this goes to your point earlier, particularly when you don't have a plan to source the raw materials required for these vehicles in a manner that is ethical, or that also conforms, I think, to many of the human rights concerns that have been raised over some of these technologies.
Well, so let's talk about that for a minute. You don't mention cobalt, or at least I'm not seeing it in your congressional testimony, and you didn't mention it. You and Ted Nordhaus, who's the director of the Breakthrough Institute, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal on April 13th. But cobalt is a key component in these batteries, right? That gives them higher energy density, better power performance. LFP, lithium phosphate or lithium iron phosphate batteries are good, but they don't have that same punch, right? They don't have as much energy density.
Yes.
Um, Cobalt is a very problematic metal, is it not? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the bulk of cobalt, of course, comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there is a fair bit of artisanal mining, I think is the phrase that's used.
Right.
Effectively, it's child labor at its worst. This is a country that has some of the worst atrocities when it comes to the exploitation of children, etc. Also that I think we can drive around in our electric cars and feel good about ourselves. Let me be very clear. That doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with the working conditions that surround the sourcing of fossil fuels, right? I think that very often people say, "Oh, look at how bad it is to source cobalt, and because of that, we should keep fossil fuels." That's not what I think. However, I do think that there are some supply chain considerations where EV batteries in particular are concerned that need to be addressed. Now, in recent years, we have seen automakers, for example, try to address this by reducing our dependence on cobalt and increasing the amount of nickel that we have in batteries. So historically, you effectively had what we call an NMC 111, right? Equal parts lithium, equal parts nickel, equal parts manganese, equal parts cobalt. And over time, we have changed those chemistries to NMC 532, NMC 811, etc., where effectively the absolute amount of manganese and cobalt in the battery is going down significantly, and the amount of nickel is going up. And of course, we get a lot of our nickel from Indonesia, which generally poses fewer problems. But we still require, for better or worse, cobalt and manganese. And if you look at the administration's, targets to electrify, as I'm sure you're aware, the EPA just released its new, tailpipe standard 2 weeks ago. It is a de facto mandate to electrify up to 67% of the fleet. If you look at the congressional testimony, I think on the second to last page, we have an outline that shows whether or not we can sell or we can source a sufficient amount of critical minerals to meet that electrification target. And the answer is no, at least from, the United States and from our allies. So where are you finding all that, all the cobalt and all that manganese and all that lithium?
Right, I'm looking at it here. This is on page 10 of your congressional testimony, which I just simply Googled Ashley Nunes and congressional testimony, and it came up. But
Oh,
you're showing the thousands of metric tons, particularly of copper,
mhm.
which would be required to meet these mandates. But you also go through graphite, lithium, manganese, nickel, phosphate. You don't mention rare earth elements, which of course is part of this and what is included in the uh, in the magnets in the vehicles, the neodymium iron boron magnets. But these are just staggering mining numbers. And again, mining is not a popular industry either. So again, this just seems there are several parts of this policy that don't seem to be very well thought out. And why is I know that the mining issue is getting more attention, but I still see a massive disconnect between what is in the physical world and what's in the policy world. Do you think about it in those terms? This kind of how the policymakers are not they are seemingly ignorant or want to ignore the physical constraints of the network that you've talked about this about the in your section on the minerals that this is the key constraint. How do you typify that? How do you think about it?
Well, I would certainly, I certainly would not call policymakers ignorant. What I
Oh,
would
go.
say, yeah, no, not that I'm suggesting you are either.
You can.
What I would say, what I would say is that the public likes white sugar, right? People want an easy solution that can be condensed in a few words that you can invariably, gravitate towards in a campaign during an election of some sort. Nobody wants to hear that the road to decarbonization is not easy, it's not pretty, and it's going to require a lot of sacrifice from all of us. Technology certainly can help us alleviate some of the suffering, if you will, that is associated with that. But there is a price to be paid, and very often the people who pay that particular price, at least, tend to be middle and low income households. And I think the question then becomes, how do you reconcile what you believe, when it comes to decarbonization, against the externalities or the consequences, the negative consequences associated with such a policy? So, for example, if you say we want people to buy electric cars, okay, some people can't afford them. Well, guess what? We're going to give everyone a subsidy. Well, the subsidy isn't nowhere or nearly enough to cover their costs. Oh, okay. And guess what? The electric cars require all these minerals. Well, what are we going to do about that? And of course, as you know, permitting reform is currently a hot topic in Congress. Well, what we need to do is we need to make it easier to mine for minerals. Well, we don't want to do that because that also destroys the environment. Okay, well, where are you going to find the minerals from? Well, we'll just work with our allies. Well, guess what? Our allies have electrification needs of their own, right? They have their own goals for electrification. Australia isn't just going to hand over all its lithium to us just because we say so. There are other countries that are also after Australia's lithium deposits.
Sure.
And right, and what that's going to create effectively is a bidding war in the free market. And if you believe in the tenets of a free market, right, there's going to be a bidding war. That's going to push commodity prices up. And when prices rise, of course, the price of the electric car is going to go up even more. So I don't see what the pathway currently is towards selling lots of these vehicles, uh, meeting the emissions targets that we actually have, and ensuring that the price point doesn't effectively price out or bankrupt large numbers of Americans. I don't know what that currently looks like. I don't see what the pathway is.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I see the same thing. I just don't see how this massive turnover. I put something on Twitter the other day, just that I passed a lot of electric vehicle charging stations between here and Tulsa, and there was not one vehicle being charged at the stops where we stopped to refuel. And I thought, well, why are we building all this stuff then? Who's going to charge this? Who's going to use this? But let's talk about the automakers themselves. Because as I look at this, and GM has said, well, we're going all in on EVs. Is it possible that in a few years, GM is going to be on the precipice and that taxpayers will have to bail them out because of all this malinvestment in EVs at the expense of them building internal combustion engine vehicles that people actually want to buy?
Well, I would be very cautious about suggesting that GM or indeed any automaker is going all in on EVs. If you look at the marketing language, and that this is very, very important, you need to look at the language that they use. What they will often say is, well, by 2030 or by 2035, we envision only selling electric cars, or we
Okay.
aspire
Fair,
to only,
fair,
right, right,
okay,
or we
fair,
aspire to, yeah,
fair
or
enough.
we
Okay.
aspire to only sell electric cars. I aspire to do many things in my life, right? That doesn't mean that, I'm actually going to do it. Mercedes, arguably, I think, is one of the more interesting automakers, in large part because I think, they came out and they said we are only going to sell electric cars. And when they released their press release, there was a little asterisk by it. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, it says, only in markets where conditions allow, right?
Aha.
Right. So again, I think you have to be very, very cautious when you hear automakers say we're going to go completely electric. Right? Because invariably they are there to make a profit and to provide the type of technology that consumers want to buy, not the type of technology that government wants consumers to buy.
So, well, then let me interrupt because you made this point about that 67. The EPA mandates on tailpipes is said a de facto mandate to electrify 67% of the fleet, or
Mhm.
two thirds. Well, okay, let me. So I'm testing you here, Ashley, or pushing you a little bit. What
No, go for it.
if you were going to bet $100 would you bet $100 that that is going to happen by 2032? Is that right? The target date? What would or let me put it this way: what are the odds that that will actually happen?
Um, well, I would say two things. The first is that is less given what public policy currently looks like. I think on balance, it is less likely it is unlikely that's going to happen. That's the first thing I would say.
Okay.
More importantly, I think even if you hit that sales target, it's irrelevant from the perspective of emissions reductions, because this particular target is only targeting the sale of electric cars, right? And remember that if what you care about is emissions reductions, it's not about selling the electric car. It's about getting someone to trade in their current gasoline powered vehicle for the electric car. And that's not what we are seeing in the market. Last year, let's just take 2022. In 2022, Norway's, if you look at new vehicle sales, electric cars accounted for 80% of new vehicle sales in Norway last year, right? Which is remarkable. It's actually not that remarkable when you consider how much money the Norwegian government is throwing at subsidizing these cars, but we'll put that off to the side for a second. So everyone keeps saying, look at Norway, look at how many electric cars they're selling. What they won't point you to is government data that shows that if you track the number of vehicles on Norway's roads over the last 40 years, which is at the same time the government was pumping large volumes of money into electric cars, the number of vehicles on Norway's roads is going up, which tells you that people are not replacing gasoline powered cars. They're just going out and buying additional cars, which, as we've demonstrated, isn't really a meaningful or the best way of lowering emissions. You're paying people to just buy additional cars and keep them in their driveways. How is that a sustainable policy?
You know, I
Right.
hadn't,
So if the Biden administration says, hey, we want 67% EV sales, I don't think you'll hit that. But even if you did, that hardly is a pathway to emissions reductions if in every single household across America, you just have more and more cars in the driveway.
I hadn't thought about it those ways. So, well, I'll read it back to you. So we'd just be adding cars to the fleet, not necessarily decarbonizing.
That's a fair assessment, yes.
Was similar in some ways to the growth of solar and wind, right? It's not necessarily that
Mhm.
we're reducing a whole lot of hydrocarbon consumption. We're just adding more electric generation
Absolutely.
to what the existing fleet is already doing.
Absolutely. And to me, this is an unworkable policy. I just don't, I don't understand why there's this emphasis on sales versus an emphasis on looking at the replacement of internal combustion engines, right? That's what we really care about. Something like a cash for clunkers program or something to that effect, right? Where we take all these more polluting cars off the roads in their entirety. We don't just keep them on the road and also add an electric car.
Right. But that is in fact what's happening, and so that these EVs are becoming the secondary, or you point out the tertiary vehicles. So let's look at the last part of your testimony, and it's one that I think jives with or matches what I heard some Toyota executives talking about just a few months ago in Dallas. I want to read back or paraphrase what I think you're saying here. A better investment in terms of decarbonization for transportation would be in hybrids, not in full electric vehicles. Is that a fair way to read back what your outlook on this?
I think it depends on from whose perspective you are looking at this.
Okay.
However, generally, if you look both for automakers and for consumers, yes, hybrids are a cost-effective means of emissions reduction, or are arguably, to me at least, the most cost-effective means of emissions reductions. In fact, I guess one could make the case that they are a cost-effective means of emissions reductions for the government as well, right? Because you don't have to worry as much about spending these billions and billions of dollars on charging infrastructure, etc.
Well, I'll read back what you said. That's an interesting point because it's not just in the vehicles themselves or the rebates, but you don't have to build the recharging. My take has been if it comes with a plug, I don't want it. I don't, I want to deal with a plug. But you said Breakthrough's work finds HEVs, hybrid electric vehicles, are a more climate friendly alternative to an EV if the EV covers less than approximately 96,000 miles across its lifetime and an HEV covers 180,000 miles. And you said because HEVs cost less, the magnitude of EV cost penalties relative to their emission reductions benefits makes HEVs a more promising near-term emission reduction pathway. It's interesting thing about it. The emissions part, the presentation I heard the Toyota guys making was saying if you look at the minerals required,
Yeah.
far better to use those minerals in hybrids because you get a more reduction over the life of all of those hybrids than you do over a fewer number of EVs, which I was an explanation I had not heard before, but thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Representative Kathy Rogers, for example, from Washington State, I think that was one of the points she was making during last week's hearing, and that's exactly correct. You can manufacture more batteries from the same volume of minerals than you can, for a hybrid than you can for an EV.
Right,
And what that effectively means is that you can just service more vehicles. Now, the counter argument will be, well, yeah, you can do that. However, an EV is cleaner than a hybrid electric
right,
car.
yeah,
Yes, it is, but that doesn't necessarily make it the most cost-effective solution, right? And
yeah,
I think this is really what we're trying to get at. What is the most cost-effective means of emissions reduction? And I mean, hybrids have a very strong value proposition, particularly, and I can't emphasize this enough, particularly for low-income Americans who often do not have a garage where they can charge their vehicle,
right,
right? You simply could not get sufficient charging infrastructure in place to give middle and low-income Americans access to the same ease of charging that upper-income Americans have. Not everyone has a driveway to keep three or four cars.
right. Yeah, that's a really good point. One that I think, goes back to the class issue, right? You're not, I was in New Orleans last year and I was speaking at an event and I walked around the area around the Superdome, and New Orleans is one of the poorest big cities in America. And the neighborhood around the Superdome is not fashionable. And there were no Teslas in that neighborhood. There are no Teslas in the barrio or in the hood. They're just not. And so I think that those are key points, and it's not just that they're unaffordable. They don't have the charging infrastructure to make them work, even if they were affordable, which I think is another key point. My guest again is Ashley Nunes. He's the Director of Federal Policy, Climate, and Energy at Breakthrough Institute. Two last questions, Ashley. We've been talking for about an hour. I ask every guest, what are you reading? What are the books that are on top of your book pile these days? Who do you dig? Who are the authors you like?
Oh, what am I reading? Well, I read the Financial Times a lot. Uh,
Okay.
that's I'm actually rereading Pale Blue Dot. Some of Carl Sagan's work. I'm a big fan of Carl Sagan,
Uh huh.
and I'm also doing a little bit of reading from a little bit of fiction reading, etc. I mean, one of my favorite books that I often recommend to students is The Carbon Footprint of Everything.
Huh. Okay.
And I think it's a healthy way for people to understand the old Milton Friedman line, there is no free lunch, right? There are often consequences to any action that we take. And I think where climate change particularly is concerned, we are not necessarily heading in a good direction. And the answer isn't necessarily what many politicians, want to hear. Again, people can debate whether or not you can have your cake and eat it too. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical. I think there certainly are ways that technology can deliver remarkable solutions. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should be in the tank for every solution that someone proposes.
In the tank. I like nice,
Well, yeah, okay,
nice play on
yeah,
words
that's
there.
right. Given our
So the carbon footprint of everything. Who wrote that? That's a book I have not heard of.
Oh, I mean, I'd have to look that up. I
No,
read it a
no,
while back.
that's
Just
okay.
there are very specific sections of that particular book that appeal to me. So yeah, I
No
can.
problem. So last question then, Ashley. What we've talked about a lot of things. You said you've talked about we've talked about unworkable policy and some of these issues and challenges in the policy realm. And you've worked in policy and economics for a while. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think if we look at the history of human innovation, we've always found a way to, I think, to put our best foot forward and come up with means of addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time. Certainly, the rollout of the COVID vaccine was one of them, right? Where in a record amount of time, people were able to bring that technology to market. Now, let's set off to the side whether or not how effective you think the technology was, etc. But I think generally speaking, people are quite good at coming up with novel solutions. But it also means that we have to be willing to cast off to the side the solutions that don't work, regardless of how badly we want them to. And I don't think electric cars is one of those solutions. I certainly don't think it's a solution that needs to be cast off to the side. I do think that it is a solution that has niche applications when you consider the transportation sector as a whole. So, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we'll stop there. My guest has been Ashley Nunes from the Breakthrough Institute. You can find out more about him at thebreakthrough.org. Ashley, thanks for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. It's been fun to talk about these issues, ones that I've been following for a while, and I appreciate your perspective and thoughts on it.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
And thanks to all you out there and all you folks out there in podcast land. If you are so inclined to give us a 5 or 12 or 15-star rating on whatever rating platform you care to. And while you're at it, follow me on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. Until next time, see ya.